There's a cedar chest in our attic, tucked under the eaves where the summer heat turns the air thick and woody. My husband, Richard, has wanted to throw it out for years. "It's just taking up space, Shirley," he'd say, his voice laced with that familiar, weary impatience. "Whatever's in there, it's from another life. Let it go." But I could never part with it. It's not just a box of old things, it's the coffin of the girl I used to be. A girl who believed in the unwavering permanence of a family's love. I haven't opened it in 30 years. Not since the day Richard carried it up the rickety attic stairs of our first tiny, rented house, his face grim with the weight of both the chest and the life we were about to begin. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, when the low hum of the refrigerator is the only sound and the ghosts of my past feel particularly close, I think about that chest. It sits up there in the dark, a silent monument to the day my life was cleaved in two. The day my parents drove away and left me standing on a curb, my graduation gown still folded neatly in a box at my feet. It all began, as so many tragedies do, on a day that was supposed to be a triumph. My college graduation. The air in Ohio that May was sweet with the scent of cut grass and blooming peonies. I remember the feel of the starched collar of my blouse under the heavy academic gown, the slightly too tight shoes I'd bought especially for the occasion, and the dizzying sense of possibility that buzzed in my veins. I was Shirley Evans, Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, with a future that felt as wide and blue as the Midwestern sky above us. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor Evans, sat in the third row. My father, a man forged from pragmatism and steel, looked uncharacteristically proud, his usual stern expression softened by the pomp and circumstance of the day. He was a factory foreman, a man who understood torque and tonnage, not poetry and prose, but he respected the piece of paper I was about to receive. He saw it as a tool, a key to a door that had been locked for his generation. My mother, Eleanor, was a watercolor painting of a woman, all soft edges and muted tones. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief as my name was called, her smile a fragile, beautiful thing. I remember catching her eye as I walked across the stage, and in that fleeting moment, the world felt perfect. I was their daughter, their accomplishment, the culmination of their quiet sacrifices. We took photographs afterward on the university lawn. There's one I can still see with perfect clarity, though the physical copy is buried deep within that cedar chest. My father stands on my right, ramrod straight in his Sunday suit, a hand placed formally on my shoulder. My mother is on my left, clinging to my arm, her head tilted slightly towards mine. And me in the middle, beaming, holding my diploma like a scepter. If you look closely at that photograph, you can almost see the fissures, the hairline cracks in the facade of our happy family. You can see the tension in my father's jaw, the subtle fear in my mother's eyes, the naive, blissful ignorance in my own smile. We were a family on the brink, and I was the only one who couldn't see the cliff's edge. The source of those fissures, the tremor that would eventually cause the earthquake, was Richard. I had met him the year before. He wasn't a student. He was a local artist who rented a small, dusty studio above a bookstore downtown. He painted vast, moody landscapes of the Ohio River and sculpted strange, beautiful figures from scrap metal. He was everything my father was not, passionate, spontaneous, and utterly unconcerned with the practicalities of life. To me, he was a revelation. He saw the world in color and metaphor, the way I did. He didn't just read the poems I loved, he understood the soul behind them. Our love was a whirlwind, a fever dream of late-night conversations, shared books, and the smell of turpentine and oil paint that clung to his clothes. I was utterly, irrevocably in love. My parents, however, saw him not as a poet, but as a problem. To my father, Richard represented instability. A man who worked with his hands not to build something solid and reliable, but to create things. Things that didn't have a clear market value. An artist, Shirley, my father had said, the first time I brought Richard home for a Sunday dinner. The word artist was pronounced as if it were a communicable disease. What's his 5-year plan? What's his pension situation? A man needs a trade, not a hobby. Richard, bless his heart, had tried. He spoke of his commissions, his gallery showings in Columbus, but my father's eyes were like granite. He had already passed his judgment. My mother was quieter in her disapproval. She would watch Richard with a worried little frown, her hands twisting in her apron. She was concerned with the more immediate details. He was older than me by 8 years. He was divorced, a fact my parents considered a catastrophic moral failure. He lived, in their words, like a bohemian, in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor and books stacked to the ceiling. "He's not our kind of people, dear," she'd whisper to me in the kitchen, as if our kind of people were a protected species. I tried to defend him, to make them see the man I saw, the kindness in his eyes, the gentle way he touched my face, the fierce intelligence that burned in him. But I was speaking a language they couldn't or wouldn't understand. Their love for me was a sturdy, well-built house, but it had only one door, and they were the sole gatekeepers. To them, my love for Richard was not an expansion of my world, but a betrayal of theirs. The tension simmered for months, a low, constant hum of disapproval beneath the surface of our lives. It came out in sideways comments, in loaded silences, in the way my father would change the subject whenever I mentioned Richard's name. I thought I could manage it. I believed, with the unshakable optimism of youth, that once I graduated, once I had my degree and stood on my own 2 feet, they would see that I was an adult capable of making my own choices. They would see Richard not as a threat, but as the man their accomplished, independent daughter had chosen. I was so terribly wrong. The day of my graduation, after the ceremony and the photographs, we went to a local restaurant for a celebratory lunch. The conversation was stilted. My father talked about job prospects, about graduate school, about the sensible paths I could now take. He spoke of a future for me that was a straight, clean line, a path he had mentally paved himself. He never once mentioned Richard, who was, at that very moment, waiting for me back at my small campus apartment to celebrate in our own way. The air grew thick with all the things we weren't saying. I finally couldn't take it anymore. Pushing my half-eaten salad away, I took a deep breath. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Richard has asked me to marry him." Silence. A complete, deafening void of sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My father placed his fork and knife down on his plate with a quiet, deliberate click. The sound echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. He stared at me, his face a mask of cold fury. It was a look I had seen only a few times in my life, a look that always preceded a storm. "No," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, flat statement of fact, as if he were declaring the sky was blue. "Dad, I love him," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "We're going to get married." "You will do no such thing," he replied, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something dangerous. "You will not throw your life away. You will not throw everything we have worked for away on that vagrant." "Arthur, please," my mother whispered, placing a trembling hand on his arm. He shook it off without looking at her. His eyes were locked on mine. "This is not a discussion, Shirley," he said. "This is a decision. You will end this foolishness with him. You will come home, you will get a respectable job, and you will forget this ever happened. If you do not, if you choose him, then you are no longer our daughter." The words hung in the air, glittering and sharp. "You don't mean that," I whispered, hot tears welling in my eyes. I looked at my mother, my silent, gentle mother, begging her with my eyes to intervene, to soften him, to say something. She just stared down at her plate, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her silence was its own form of violence, a quiet, passive betrayal that cut me just as deeply as my father's ultimatum. In that moment, I saw that she would always choose him. She had built her entire life around the solid, unyielding pillar of my father, and she was too afraid to stand without it, even for her own child. "I mean every word," my father said, his voice like ice. "Him or us. Choose." My world tilted on its axis. The love I had believed to be unconditional, the very bedrock of my existence, was suddenly revealed to be a contract with fine print I had never been allowed to read. And I had just violated its primary clause. A strange, cold calm washed over me. It was the calm of pure shock, the body's last defense against a pain too great to process. I looked at my father's unforgiving face, at my mother's averted gaze, and I knew. I knew there was no negotiation. There was no middle ground. They had drawn a line in the sand, and they were demanding I choose which side to die on. "I choose him," I said. The words came out as a whisper, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. I saw something flicker in my father's eyes, not pain, not sadness, but a kind of grim satisfaction. He had won in his own mind. He had proven his point. I was the one who had made the choice. I was the one severing the tie. He stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. "Then we are done here," he said. "Eleanor, we're leaving." My mother stood up like a marionette whose strings had been pulled, her face pale and streaked with silent tears. She wouldn't look at me. She just followed him, a shadow trailing in the wake of his righteous anger. I sat there alone at the table, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had become a funeral. The waitress came over, a look of pity on her young face. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, paid the bill with the graduation money my grandmother had sent me, and walked out of the restaurant into a world that no longer felt like mine. When I got back to my apartment, I told Richard what had happened. He held me as I sobbed, as the shock wore off and the agonizing reality set in. He held me and promised me we would be okay, that he would be my family now, that we would build a new life, a better life, a life filled with love and art and freedom. And I believed him. I clung to him like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. He was all I had left. The final, brutal act of the severance came the next day. My parents were supposed to help me move my things out of my campus apartment and back home for the summer. Instead, my father's car pulled up to the curb, and only he got out. He didn't come upstairs. He just stood by the car, his arms crossed, and waited. I brought my things down, box by box. My textbooks, my clothes, the few sentimental items I had. My father said nothing. He just watched me with those cold, judgmental eyes. The last item was the cedar chest. It had been my grandmother's, and it held all my childhood treasures, old diaries, photographs, my baby blanket, letters from summer camp. It was too heavy for me to carry alone. "I can't take the chest," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "It won't fit in Richard's car." "Fine," he said, his voice flat. "Leave it. We'll take it home." For a fleeting, insane moment, I felt a surge of hope. The chest. They were keeping the chest. It felt like a connection, a thread, however thin. When I had piled my few pathetic boxes and suitcases on the sidewalk, my father finally spoke. "This is it, then," he said. It wasn't a question. He opened his wallet and pulled out a few bills. $200. "This is the last you'll ever get from us," he said, pressing the money into my hand. "Don't call. Don't write. Don't come to the house. As of this moment, we don't have a daughter." He got back in the car. My mother was in the passenger seat. I could see her silhouette, her head turned away from me, looking out the opposite window. She never once looked in my direction. She never waved. She never gave any sign that the girl standing on the sidewalk, the girl she had given birth to and raised for 21 years, even existed. And then they drove away. I watched the taillights of their sensible brown sedan disappear around the corner, leaving me alone on the curb with my boxes, my $200, and the echoing finality of his words. That was the beginning of my life with Richard. And for a while, it was enough. We were rebels, castaways, a two-person nation founded on love and defiance. We found a tiny house to rent on the outskirts of town, with peeling paint and a yard full of weeds that we promised ourselves we would turn into a garden. We furnished it with cast-offs from thrift stores and Richard's salvage sculptures. It was our fortress against the world, our sanctuary. The first few years were a blur of passionate creation and desperate poverty. Richard painted with a feverish intensity, pouring all of our shared pain and hope onto his canvases. I found a job at the local library, the quiet aisles and the smell of old paper a balm to my shattered soul. But the ghost of my family was always there, a third person in our marriage. Every holiday was a fresh wound. On Christmas, I would find myself staring at the phone, my hand hovering over the receiver, a desperate, childish hope rising in my chest that this time they would call. They never did. On my birthday, I would wait for a card that never came. I sent them a letter once on their anniversary, a few years after the schism. It was a simple card, one with a picture of a lighthouse on the front. Inside, I just wrote, "I'm thinking of you. I love you. Shirley." I never received a reply. Richard found me crying a week later and held me. "You're better off, Cheryl," he'd murmur into my hair. "They don't deserve you." His words were meant to be a comfort, but over time, they began to feel like the bars of a cage. My sacrifice, the family I had given up for him, became an unspoken debt between us. When his art didn't sell, when the bills piled up, when the rejection letters from galleries arrived, a new, ugly side of Richard began to emerge. The passionate artist became a brooding, resentful man. The arguments started quietly, then escalated. "Do you have any idea the pressure I'm under?" he would snarl, throwing a paintbrush across the studio. "You gave up everything for me. Your perfect little family, your perfect little future. And for what? For this. For a husband who can't even pay the electric bill." My pain became his weapon. He would wield my abandonment like a club, using it to beat me into submission whenever I dared to voice a complaint or a worry. If I was sad, it was my own fault for mourning a family that wasn't worth it. If I was anxious about money, I was ungrateful for the life he was struggling to provide, the very life I had chosen over the comfort and security of my parents. The man who had been my rescuer was slowly becoming my jailer. The emotional abuse was insidious, a slow-acting poison. It wasn't about shouting matches, not always. It was in the calculated silences, the way he would dismiss my feelings, the way he made me feel that my sadness was an inconvenience to his artistic temperament. We had children, a son, Daniel, and then a daughter, Clara. I poured all of my fractured love into them. I was determined to be the mother mine had not been. I would be their soft place to land, their unconditional supporter. I would never, ever make them choose. I would never, ever drive away. But the strain of my marriage, the constant walking on eggshells around Richard's moods, the deep, unresolved grief over my own parents, it all cast a long shadow over our home. The house was never a place of easy joy. It was a place of tension, of whispered arguments behind closed doors, of a mother who smiled brightly at her children while her heart was breaking. My children grew up knowing about their grandparents only as a vague, sad story. Mommy's parents live far away, I'd say. It's complicated. How could I explain to them that their own grandparents had willingly and completely excised their mother from their lives? How could I explain a cruelty so profound that even I, after all these years, couldn't fully comprehend it? The years passed in this way, a long, monotonous stretch of quiet desperation punctuated by moments of genuine joy with my children. They were my reason for everything. I watched them grow, I celebrated their triumphs, and I held them through their heartbreaks. And as they grew older and prepared to leave for college themselves, a new kind of fear began to grip me. The fear that the cycle would repeat, that some failing in me would cause a rift with them. I clung to them so tightly, I'm afraid I sometimes smothered them. Richard's art never took off in the way he dreamed. He eventually took a job teaching art at the local community college, a compromise that curdled him with a bitterness that never really left. Our marriage settled into a state of armed truce. We were two lonely people sharing a house, bound together by history and shared wounds, but the love that had once been a blazing fire was now just a pile of cold ashes. He still saw me as the embodiment of his failed ambitions, and I saw him as the man who had promised me a new world, only to build me a prettier prison. And then, about 6 months ago, the past came crashing back. I was scrolling through the internet, a mindless habit to pass a lonely evening. I stumbled upon the online alumni page for my parents' old high school. They were from a small town about 2 hours away, the same town they still lived in. And there it was, an announcement splashed across the top of the page, Northwood High School class of 1968, 55th reunion. There was a date, a time, and a location, the ballroom of a hotel in their hometown. And then I saw the list of attendees who had already RSVP'd, Arthur and Eleanor Evans. Seeing their names in print, so stark and official, felt like a physical shock, like touching a live wire. For nearly 4 decades, they had been abstract figures, ghosts in my memory. But this made them real. They were alive. They were well enough to be attending a reunion. They were going to be in a public place at a specific time. For the first time in 38 years, I knew exactly where they would be. A storm of emotions erupted inside me. Rage, white-hot and searing. Grief, a vast, cold ocean of it. And beneath it all, a tiny, flickering ember of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in decades. A desperate, childish longing. The urge to see them was immediate and overwhelming. Not to reconcile. I knew, with a certainty that had settled deep in my bones, that reconciliation was impossible. That door had been nailed shut and barricaded long ago. No, this was something else. It was a need to be seen. I wanted, just once, to stand in front of them as the woman I had become. Not the tearful, 21-year-old girl they had discarded on a sidewalk, but a 60-year-old woman who had survived. A woman who had built a life, however broken. A woman who had raised 2 children, who had loved and lost, who had endured. I wanted them to look at me, to really look at me, and be forced to acknowledge the life they had thrown away. I didn't want their love, not anymore. I didn't want their apology. I wanted them to see the flesh and blood consequence of their monstrous choice. The idea took root in my mind and became an obsession. I told no one. Not Richard, who would have called it a pathetic, sentimental exercise in self-torture. Not my children, who I didn't want to burden with my ghosts. This was my journey to take alone. For weeks, I wrestled with the decision. Was it madness? Was I just looking for more pain? What could possibly be gained? I would play the scene out in my head over and over. Me, walking into that ballroom. The look on their faces. What would I say? What would they do? Most days, I decided it was a terrible, self-destructive idea. I would close the laptop and try to put it out of my mind, focusing on my garden, on a new book, on anything to distract me. But the thought always returned, pulling at me like a tide. It felt like the final chapter of a book I had been forced to leave unfinished. My entire adult life had been defined by their absence, by the gaping hole they had left. Maybe this was the only way to finally, truly, understand what had been lost. Maybe this was the only way to stop being the girl on the curb and become the woman who walked away on her own terms. The day of the reunion arrived. It was a Saturday in October. The leaves were turning, painting the Ohio landscape in brilliant shades of red and gold. I told Richard the First was going to visit an old friend from the library who had moved a few hours away. It was a flimsy lie, but he was so absorbed in his own world that he barely registered it. He just grunted in acknowledgement from behind his newspaper. I got in my car, a sensible sedan not unlike the one my father had driven all those years ago. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I felt 21 again and 60 all at once. The 2-hour drive was a journey through time. Every mile that brought me closer to my hometown brought a fresh wave of memory. The curve in the road where I'd learned to drive. The old ice cream stand where my father would take me on hot summer nights. The bridge over the creek where I'd had my first kiss. It was a landscape of ghosts. I drove past my childhood home. It looked smaller, shabbier. Different people lived there now. A bicycle lay overturned in the driveway where my father's car used to be parked. The big oak tree in the front yard, the one I had a swing on, was gone. It was just a house. It held no power over me anymore. The power was never in the place. It was in the people. I found the hotel easily. It was a modern, anonymous-looking building on the edge of town. I parked my car in the sprawling lot and just sat there for a long time, the engine off, the silence ringing in my ears. I could see the entrance to the ballroom. People my parents' age, dressed in their Saturday best, were trickling in. They were laughing, hugging old friends, their faces animated with the joy of reminiscence. They were all there to look back, to celebrate the past. And I was there to confront it. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car. I smoothed down my simple black dress, a dress I had bought for the occasion. A dress that I hoped made me look dignified, invisible, and strong, all at the same time. I walked across the parking lot, each step feeling momentous, like I was wading through deep water. I reached the glass doors of the entrance, and I could hear the murmur of the crowd and the faint sound of music from a bygone era. My entire life, it seemed, had been leading to this single moment. I could still turn back. I could get in my car, drive home, and climb into the attic to sit beside the cedar chest, the two of us silent keepers of a dead girl's story. Or I could open this door. I could walk into that room and face the people who had created me and then uncreated me. My hand, still trembling, reached for the handle. I was about to step into the same room as my parents for the first time in 38 years. And I had absolutely no idea what would happen next. The brass handle of the ballroom door was cold, shockingly so, against my trembling palm. It felt solid, heavy, an unyielding barrier between the quiet anonymity of the hotel corridor and the roaring furnace of my past. For a heartbeat, I considered letting go. I could turn around, walk back to my car, and drive the 2 hours home. Richard would be none the wiser. My children would never know. I could lock this insane impulse away, bury it deep in the attic of my mind alongside the cedar chest and all the other sealed-off relics of my history. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the door handle, that if I walked away now, I would be walking away from the last chance I had to reclaim any part of myself. I would spend the rest of my life as that girl on the curb, forever watching those taillights disappear. I was 60 years old. I was done with being left behind. I tightened my grip, pushed down, and the heavy door swung inward with a soft, hydraulic sigh. The wave of sensory information that hit me was staggering. First, the sound. A wall of noise, a cacophony of laughter, shouted greetings, and the tinny, cheerful strains of a song from the 60s, something about wanting to hold someone's hand. Then, the smell. A strange medley of hotel-catered food, spilled wine, and the cloying sweetness of a dozen different perfumes worn by women who had been saving them for a special occasion. The light was dim, punctuated by the glitter of a spinning disco ball that cast fractured diamonds of light across the room, catching on silver hair and sequin tops. The room was a sea of faces, all of them etched with the maps of 60-something years of life, all of them animated with a joy and camaraderie that made me feel like a ghost at a feast. My first instinct was to retreat, to melt back into the hallway, but the door had already swung shut behind me, the latch clicking with an awful finality. I was in. I stood just inside the entrance, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, trying to make myself as small as possible. A woman with a cloud of impossibly blonde hair and a bright pink jacket brushed past me, calling out a name, her face lit with the pure, uncomplicated delight of seeing a long-lost friend. Everyone here had a place. Everyone belonged to the shared tapestry of a common past. My past with them had been surgically removed, leaving a scar no one but me could see. To my left was a long table draped in a navy blue cloth, the school colors. Behind it sat a woman with a kind, wrinkled face and reading glasses perched on her nose. A sign in front of her read, "Welcome Northwood High Class of 68. Please sign in." This was the first hurdle. My stomach twisted. I needed a reason to be here, a way to move through the room without arousing immediate suspicion. I took a hesitant step toward the table. "Hello, dear," the woman said, her voice warm and welcoming. "Here for the reunion?" "Yes," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. "Wonderful. And your name?" She held a pen poised over a sheet of pre-printed name tags. I froze. What was my name? For 38 years, I had been Shirley Evans, a name that belonged to Richard, to my children. But in this room, in the context of this history, that name meant nothing. I was Arthur and Eleanor's daughter. Before I could even think, the name tumbled out of my mouth. Shirley. Shirley Evans. The woman's eyes scanned the list. Evans. Evans. "I'm not seeing it here, honey. Did you RSVP?" "No," I said, a flush of heat creeping up my neck. "I'm sorry. I wasn't sure I could make it. I was in town visiting, and I just decided at the last minute." The lie felt clumsy and inadequate. The woman gave me a sympathetic smile. "Oh, that happens. No problem at all." She picked up a blank name tag and a marker. "Let's just make you one. Shirley, how do you spell the last name?" "EVNS," I spelled out, the letters feeling alien in my mouth. She wrote it down in a neat, looping script, peeled the back off, and handed it to me. I took it, my fingers fumbling. Sticking it to the fabric of my black dress felt like branding myself. Shirley Evans. Here, in this room, the name was not an identity, it was an accusation. It was a connection I was claiming, a right I was asserting, a right that had been violently revoked. With the name tag affixed to my chest, I had a flimsy shield of legitimacy. I murmured my thanks to the woman and forced myself to step away from the table, deeper into the room. I moved slowly, my eyes scanning, searching for two faces in a crowd of hundreds. The task felt monumental, impossible. I kept to the edges of the room, trailing my fingers along the wall as if for balance. I passed a table laden with old yearbooks, their pages splayed open, revealing the black and white faces of hopeful teenagers. I saw faces I vaguely recognized, people who had been seniors when I was a child, names I'd heard my parents mention in passing. Bill Anderson, the star quarterback. Susan Miller, the homecoming queen. They were here, their youthful faces in the book a stark contrast to the stooped shoulders and thinning hair of the people laughing and pointing at the pictures. The room was a time machine, and it was churning up memories I had long since buried. I remembered my father talking about his high school days with a rare nostalgia, talking about football games and the chemistry teacher who had inspired him to be precise and methodical. I remembered my mother showing me her prom dress, a pale yellow gown carefully preserved in a plastic bag, telling me about the boy who had been too shy to ask her to dance. These were their stories, their foundations. I had been a part of that legacy, the next chapter, until I had decided to write my own book. And they had responded by burning the library. My eyes swept past a knot of men in ill-fitting suits, laughing loudly and slapping each other on the back. They passed a group of women huddled together, comparing photos of grandchildren on their phones. The sight sent a sharp, painful pang through my chest. Daniel and Clara. My beautiful children. My parents had two grandchildren they had never seen, never held, never even acknowledged. Grandchildren with my father's determined jawline and my mother's soft, contemplative eyes. They had sacrificed not only a daughter, but the entire future that came with her. The sheer, staggering waste of it all hit me with the force of a physical blow, and I had to stop and lean against the wall, catching my breath. What kind of pride, what kind of anger is so absolute that it would deny itself the simple, universal joy of being a grandparent? I pushed myself off the wall and continued my slow, methodical search. I needed a drink, not for the alcohol, but just to have something to hold, something to do with my hands. I made my way to the bar at the far end of the room. As I was waiting, a woman standing next to me turned and smiled. "I'm sorry, you look so familiar," she said, her head tilted. "Did you go to Northwood?" "My parents did," I replied, my voice tight. "Arthur and Eleanor Evans." Her face lit up. "Oh my goodness. Art and Ellie." "Of course. I'm Carol Peterson. I lived 2 doors down from them on Maple Street, forever ago." "You must be Shirley. I remember you as a little girl with pigtails." The world seemed to shrink, the noise of the room fading to a dull roar. Carol Peterson. I remembered her. A kind woman who always gave out the best candy at Halloween. She was looking at me with such open, friendly warmth, completely oblivious to the chasm that had opened up in my life since she'd last seen me. "Yes," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "I remember you. Well, for heaven's sake. It's so wonderful to see you. Are Art and Ellie here?" "I haven't seen them yet. Your father was always so serious, and your mother was just the sweetest thing on earth." "I think they're here," I said, my heart starting to pound again. "I'm looking for them." "Oh, well, let's find them together," she said, grabbing my arm with an easy familiarity that was both comforting and terrifying. "They will be so thrilled to see you. Is your family with you? A husband? Children?" "They're not with me tonight," I said evasively, letting her pull me back into the throng. My mission had suddenly become a guided tour, and I was being led toward the epicenter of the earthquake by a cheerful, unsuspecting guide. We moved through the crowd, Carol calling out greetings to people as we went, me trailing in her wake like a prisoner being led to her execution. And then she stopped. "Oh, there they are," she chirped, pointing toward a small, round table near the dance floor. "Over there, by the speaker. Art. Ellie." And I saw them. Time didn't stop, but it slowed down, stretching out like warm taffy. All the noise, all the people, all the swirling lights melted away, leaving only the three of us in a silent, stark tableau. My father was sitting with his back partially to me, but I recognized him instantly. The rigid set of his shoulders, the shape of his head, the neat, precise way his gray hair was combed. He was thinner than I remembered, the formidable bulk of his foreman years having given way to the leaner frame of old age. He was wearing a dark suit, looking as formal and out of place as he had at my graduation. And my mother. She was facing me. The years had not been gentle. The soft, watercolor edges I remembered had been smudged and blurred by time, and I could see now, by a deep, abiding sadness. Her hair was thin and white, her face a web of fine lines. Her smile, as she listened to someone at the table, was a pale imitation of the one I remembered, a fragile, practiced thing that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes. They were the same. A washed-out blue, filled with a familiar, anxious apprehension. She was holding a small clutch purse in her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped it. Even from across the room, I could see the tremor in her hands. They looked old. It was a simple, stupid thought, but it was the one that hit me first. They were no longer the powerful, indomitable figures of my youth, the gods who had held my world in their hands. They were just two old people, trying to enjoy a night out, lost in a sea of other old people. A wave of something unexpected washed over me, a disorienting, sickening pity. It was followed immediately by a surge of white-hot rage. How dare they look so normal? How dare they sit here, sipping their drinks and making small talk, as if they hadn't committed an act of such profound and intimate violence that it had shaped every single day of my adult life. Carol was still holding my arm, pulling me forward. "Come on," she said. "Let's go surprise them." We were closing the distance. 30 feet. 20. 10. My breath was trapped in my chest. My legs felt like lead. They hadn't seen me yet. They were laughing at something the man next to them had said. A dry, rasping sound from my father. A high, fluttering titter from my mother. The sounds were so familiar they made my stomach ache. And then my mother looked up. Her eyes, clouded with age and distraction, swept across the approaching crowd and landed on me. For a moment, there was nothing. Just a blank, polite gaze. Then, a flicker of confusion. And then, a slow, dawning horror. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. The fragile smile vanished. Her hand flew to her mouth, the clutch purse dropping from her lap and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her eyes widened, not with joy, not with surprise, but with pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at me as if I were a specter, a vengeful spirit risen from the grave. Her reaction was a physical blow. It knocked the air from my lungs. Whatever sliver of hope I had secretly harbored, that tiny, idiotic ember that had imagined a tearful, miraculous reunion, was instantly and brutally extinguished. She wasn't seeing her daughter. She was seeing a threat, a complication, a problem that had just walked back into her carefully managed, quiet life. Her sharp intake of breath, the dropped purse, the look of horror, it was enough to make my father turn. He followed her terrified gaze, and his eyes found mine. Unlike my mother, there was no confusion in his expression. There was only a cold, hard, instantaneous recognition. The thin veneer of social pleasantry, the reunion smile, it didn't just fade, it evaporated. The mask fell away, and I was looking at the same man who had stood on the curb and told me he no longer had a daughter. His face hardened into the familiar granite of his disapproval. His eyes, which I now saw were clouded with the faint blue ring of age, narrowed into icy slits. Carol, bless her oblivious heart, was still beaming. "Art. Ellie. Look who I found," she announced, giving my arm a little shake. "It's Shirley. Isn't this just the most wonderful surprise?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The man sitting next to my parents looked from them to me, his smile faltering in the face of the palpable tension. My mother was frozen, a statue of fear, her hand still pressed to her lips. My father, however, moved with a cold, deliberate purpose. He placed his drink down on the table. He looked from my face to the name tag on my dress and back to my face. His expression was one of pure, undiluted contempt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. His power had never been in volume. It was in the chilling precision of his cruelty. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low, venomous whisper that was meant only for me, though Carol was standing right there. "You should not be here," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. Carol's smile finally died. "Art, what?" she began, confused. He ignored her completely. He never took his eyes off me. "You were told," he continued in that same deadly whisper, "to stay away. We have nothing to say to you." Behind him, my mother began to tremble visibly. A single, silent tear traced a path through the powder on her cheek. She made a small, choked sound, a sound of distress, but she did not speak. She did not look at me again. She looked at my father, her eyes pleading with him, but what she was pleading for, I couldn't tell. For him to stop? Or for him to make me go away? I stood there, rooted to the spot, Carol's hand having dropped from my arm as if she'd been burned. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In my fantasies, I was strong. I was eloquent. I had a speech prepared, a litany of my pain, a catalog of their crimes. I would make them see the woman I had become, the life I had lived. But in the face of his absolute, unwavering rejection, all the words died in my throat. I was 21 again, powerless and speechless. All I could do was stare at him, at this old man who was my father, this stranger who shared my DNA. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the lines around my own eyes, the gray in my hair, the life that had been lived entirely without him. I wanted him to acknowledge the consequence of his decree. But he acknowledged nothing. He saw only a violation of his orders, an unwelcome intrusion. Then he did the final, most brutal thing. He looked at my mother. "Eleanor," he said, his voice firm, the command unmistakable. "We're leaving." He stood up, pulling his jacket straight. He reached down, not for the purse she had dropped, but for her arm, pulling her to her feet. She rose unsteadily, like a fawn, her eyes cast down, refusing to look at me, at anyone. He put a hand on the small of her back and steered her away from the table, away from me. He didn't look back. He just walked away, carving a path through the laughing, oblivious crowd, my mother stumbling along in his wake. They walked right past me, so close I could have reached out and touched them. I smelled the faint scent of his old spice, a scent that ripped a hole in my memory, a scent from a childhood that now felt like a lie. He didn't so much as glance in my direction. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, a man on a mission. My mother, as she passed, kept her head down, her shoulders hunched, a prisoner being led away. They disappeared into the crowd, heading for the exit. I was left standing there, alone in the space they had occupied. Carol was staring at me, her mouth agape. "Shirley, I don't understand," she stammered. "It's complicated," I whispered, the phrase tasting like ash in my mouth. I turned and walked away from her, from the table, from the sympathetic, confused eyes of the strangers who had just witnessed, what? A family squabble? A scene? They had no idea they had just witnessed a soul being flayed open on the sticky floor of a hotel ballroom. I walked, my head held high, my back straight, a parody of dignity. I walked through the dancers, through the laughter, through the memories of a life that wasn't mine. I didn't run. I walked deliberately, step by step, back toward the door. I passed the table with the yearbooks again. The smiling, black and white faces seemed to mock me. I reached the entrance and pushed the door open, stepping out into the blessedly cool, quiet emptiness of the hallway. I leaned against the wall, and the facade I had so carefully constructed crumbled into dust. A sound escaped my lips, a ragged, ugly sob that was torn from the deepest part of my being. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was a howl of rage, of futility, of a pain so old and so deep it had become a part of my cellular structure. I had done it. I had shown up. I had faced them. And it had changed nothing. Or rather, it had changed everything. It had cauterized the wound. It had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that there was nothing left to salvage. There was no love buried under the anger. There was no regret hidden behind the pride. There was just a void. An empty space where a daughter used to be. The long walk back to my car was a blur. The drive home was worse. The 2 hours of road unspoled before me in the darkness, illuminated only by my headlights. I didn't cry anymore. The sobbing had left me hollowed out, empty. I was just a shell of a person, piloting a metal box through the night. The scene played over and over in my head. My mother's terrified face. My father's whispered contempt. The finality of him turning his back and walking away. He hadn't just walked away from me tonight. He had walked away from me all over again. He had confirmed the verdict he had passed down 38 years ago. Guilty. The sentence, a lifetime of exile. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, it was after midnight. The house was dark except for a single lamp left on in the living room. The quiet was profound. I had just come from a battlefield, a place of immense emotional violence, and I was returning to a world where no one even knew a war had been fought. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence, the key still in the ignition. The anger I had felt was beginning to cool, hardening into something else. Something cold and clear and sharp. I had spent my entire adult life defined by their rejection. My marriage to Richard, our poverty, our struggles, my own identity as a mother, it was all tangled up in the story of the girl who was abandoned. I had chosen Richard out of love, yes, but also out of defiance. Our life together had been a testament to my choice, a validation of my sacrifice. But what if the sacrifice was based on a lie? Not the lie that they loved me, I knew they had, once, but the lie I had told myself, that their love was worth mourning for 4 decades. That the people I lost were worthy of the pedestal of grief I had built for them in my heart. Tonight, I hadn't seen gods who had cast me out of Olympus. I had seen 2 bitter, frightened old people. A bully and his hostage. A man so brittle he would break before he would bend, and a woman who had long ago traded her own soul for a quiet life. The grief I felt was still there, but it was changing. It was no longer for the parents I had lost. It was for the years I had lost, mourning them. It was for the woman I might have been if I hadn't been carrying the weight of their judgment on my back for my entire life. I finally pulled the key from the ignition, the small metallic sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I got out of the car and walked to my front door. Inside, Richard would be asleep, oblivious. The house was the same. The street was the same. But I was not. The girl on the curb was finally, truly gone. I didn't know who was left in her place. But I knew one thing with chilling certainty. The story I had been telling myself about my life, the one that began and ended with my parents' abandonment, was over. A new story had to begin. And it would have to start with the man sleeping in my bed, the man for whom I had made that terrible, life-altering sacrifice. The confrontation with my parents was over. The confrontation with my own life was about to begin. The key turned in the lock with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. I stepped inside my own home, and for the first time in my life, it felt like a foreign country. The single lamp left on in the living room cast long, familiar shadows that suddenly seemed menacing, hiding truths I had spent a lifetime refusing to see. The air was still and thick with the scent of old books and Richard's faint, ever-present smell of turpentine, a scent I once found romantic, the very perfume of creativity. Tonight, it smelled only of stagnation, of dreams that had soured and curdled over decades. I could hear his soft, rhythmic snores from the bedroom upstairs. A steady, oblivious sound. He was sleeping the peaceful sleep of a man who believed the world was exactly as he had left it when he closed his eyes. He had no idea that a hurricane had ripped through my soul, and that I had come back a different woman, a stranger wearing his wife's face. I didn't go upstairs. Instead, I sank into the worn armchair opposite the darkened fireplace, the one with the permanent indentation of my body from thousands of quiet, lonely evenings. The cold clarity I'd felt in the car was still with me, a terrifying, exhilarating hum beneath my skin. The narrative of my life, the one I had recited to myself for 38 years, had been a simple tragedy in 2 acts. Act 1, a cruel abandonment. Act 2. A noble sacrifice for love and art. I had built my entire identity on that story. I was Shirley, the exile. Shirley, the woman who gave up everything for her man. It was a romantic, tragic role, and I had played it to perfection. But the reunion had shattered the stage. My parents weren't the formidable, godlike figures of my tragic backstory. They were small, pathetic. A coward and a bully, brittle with age and fear. And their diminishment, their fall from the pedestal of my grief, had caused the entire narrative to collapse. If they weren't worthy of the sacrifice, what did that make the sacrifice itself? What did that make the life I had built upon its foundation? My marriage to Richard, our shared life, it was no longer a defiant stand against a cruel world. It was a cage I had helped him build, bar by bar, using my own pain as the steel. I sat in the dark for hours, watching the first pale, gray light of dawn begin to filter through the windows. I heard the house stir, the groan of the pipes as the heating kicked in, the soft thud of Richard's feet hitting the floor upstairs. A few minutes later, he came down, rubbing his eyes, his hair a mess. He saw me in the chair and stopped. "Shirley, what are you doing down here? Didn't you come to bed?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "I couldn't sleep," I said. My voice was calm, steady. "It surprised me. Your friend keep you up all night gossiping," he grumbled, shuffling into the kitchen. I heard the familiar sounds, the cupboard opening, the clink of his favorite mug, the gurgle of the coffee maker. He was moving through the morning ritual of a life I was no longer a part of. He came back into the living room with his coffee, slumping onto the sofa. "I can't believe how much the price of everything is going up," he began, launching into his usual litany of morning complaints. The electric bill was a killer this month. "I swear, this teaching gig is barely worth the gas to get there. It just sucks the soul right out of you. At least I have my studio, my real work." He took a long, noisy slurp of coffee. "Speaking of which, I need to buy more cobalt blue, and that stuff isn't cheap. I hope your visit with Carol was fun, but we're going to have to be careful this month." There it was. The same speech, the same weary sighs, the same casual placement of all the world's burdens squarely on his own artistic shoulders. For 38 years, I had responded to this with soothing murmurs, with reassurances, with a quiet acceptance of my role as the practical, supportive anchor to his brilliant, troubled genius. My own worries, my own needs were always secondary, trivial interruptions to his great struggle. But this morning, his words didn't evoke my sympathy. They landed like stones, each one a small, hard piece of the prison wall. I looked at him, really looked at him, the man I had chosen over my entire world. The lines of bitterness were carved so deeply around his mouth they seemed permanent. His eyes, which I had once thought so full of passion, were now just tired and resentful. He wasn't the heroic artist anymore. He was just a disappointed man who had made my sacrifice the central excuse for his own failures. "I didn't go to see Carol," I said quietly. He looked up from his mug, annoyed at the interruption to his train of thought. "What? What are you talking about? You said you were going to see Carol." "I lied," I said. The word hung in the air between us, clean and sharp. "I drove to Northwood. I went to my parents' high school reunion." He stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into a dark, familiar anger. He put his mug down on the coffee table with a thud. "You what? Are you insane, Shirley? After all these years? What in God's name for? To go groveling back to them?" "No," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Not to grovel. I went to see them. To look at them. I wanted to see the people who did that to me." "And? Did you?" He sneered. "Did you get your little emotional fix? Did they welcome their long-lost daughter back with open arms? Of course they didn't. I could have told you that and saved you the gas. What a pathetic, sentimental waste of time." He expected me to cry. He expected me to crumble, so he could then play his part, the weary but wise protector, the man who knew better, the one who had to clean up my emotional messes. It was a dance we had done 100 times before. But I didn't cry. I just looked at him with my new, cold eyes. "You're right," I said. They didn't. My mother looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. And my father told me I shouldn't be there, and that he had nothing to say to me. He told my mother they were leaving, and they turned their backs and walked away. A flicker of something that looked like triumph crossed his face. See? What did I tell you? They're monsters. They're not worth a single one of your tears. You chose me. You chose this life. You should have just left it alone. Yes, I said, leaning forward in my chair. I did choose you. I chose you and this life. I gave up everything for you. And for 38 years, you have never let me forget it. My pain has been your primary tool, Richard. It's been your excuse, your motivation, your weapon. He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. That's a horrible thing to say. I rescued you. I gave you a home. I gave you a family when yours threw you in the gutter. You didn't rescue me, I said, the words pouring out of me now, a flood tide of truth that had been held back for decades. You saw a damsel in distress and cast yourself as the hero. My tragedy became your origin story. The profound grief of a 21-year-old girl became the noble, romantic backdrop for your life as a struggling artist. Every time you failed, every time a gallery rejected you, every time we couldn't pay a bill, you held up my sacrifice like a crucifix. Look what she gave up for me. The pressure is immense. You didn't just share my pain, Richard. You fed on it. It was the fuel for your righteous anger at the world. You didn't love me in spite of my wounds. You loved me for them. They made you feel powerful. They made you feel important. He was on his feet now, his face flushed with rage. How dare you? How dare you rewrite our entire life? I have worked my fingers to the bone for you, for this family. I gave up my own dreams, taking that soul-crushing teaching job to put food on the table. I have supported you. I have held you every single time you cried over them. And this is the thanks I get? You paint me as some kind of monster. I'm not rewriting it, I said, my voice rising to match his. I'm finally reading it clearly. You didn't give up your dreams, Richard. Your dreams didn't work out. It happens. But instead of facing that, instead of just admitting that maybe you weren't destined to be the next Jackson Pollock, you blamed the world, and you blamed the pressure of my sacrifice. It was the perfect excuse. And our children, my God, our children. They grew up in a museum of your disappointment. They had to tiptoe around your moods, around the great artist's temperament. I spent their entire childhoods trying to shield them from the bitterness that seeped out of you like a poison, trying to create pockets of joy in a house that was heavy with your resentment. I gave you those children, he roared. We built a family. No, I shouted back, and the sound of my own voice, so full of fury, was a shock. I built that family. I did it. I poured everything I had into Daniel and Clara because I was so terrified of failing them the way I had been failed. I was the one who went to every parent-teacher conference, who baked the birthday cakes, who held them when they were sick, all while walking on eggshells so I didn't disturb the artist at his work. You were just the brooding, tragic figure in the background. You loved the idea of being a father, but you couldn't stand the mundane reality of it. It interfered with your suffering. He just stood there, speechless, his mouth opening and closing. He had no response. I had taken away his narrative, his weapons, his justifications. I had stripped him bare, and all that was left was the truth. The anger drained out of me as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a vast, aching emptiness. I looked at him, this man I had shared a bed with for nearly 4 decades, and I felt nothing. No love, no hate. Just a profound and bottomless sadness for the 2 young people we had once been, the boy and girl who thought love and defiance were enough to build a world. They weren't. They had built a prison instead. I can't do this anymore, Richard, I said, my voice a whisper now. I've spent my whole life living in a story that wasn't mine. First, it was my parents' story of what a good daughter should be. Then it was your story of the great artist and his tragic muse. I don't even know what my own story is. So, what are you saying? He asked, his voice suddenly small, frightened. You're just going to throw away 38 years? They're not thrown away, I said, standing up. They happened. Daniel and Clara happened. They are the one true, beautiful thing that came from all of this. But the marriage, Richard, the thing between you and me, it died a long time ago. We've just been living with the corpse because we were too afraid to bury it. I'm not afraid anymore. I walked past him and went upstairs. He didn't follow. I went into our bedroom, the room that had witnessed so much silent sorrow, and I pulled a suitcase from the top of the closet. I moved with a strange, dreamlike calm. I packed a few clothes, my toiletries, the books from my nightstand. I didn't take much. I looked around the room, at the life I had curated, the trinkets, the photos of the children. It was like looking at a stranger's life. It no longer felt like it belonged to me. When I came downstairs, he was sitting on the bottom step, his head in his hands. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice muffled. "I don't know," I said honestly. "A hotel for now. I just know I can't stay here." I walked to the front door. My hand was on the knob when he spoke again. "Shirley," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't do this." I turned. There were tears in his eyes. And for a fleeting moment, I saw the man I had first fallen in love with, the passionate, vulnerable artist. A wave of pity washed over me. But it wasn't enough. Pity is a terrible thing to build a life on. "Goodbye, Richard," I said. And I walked out the door, closing it softly behind me. The first few weeks were a blur. I found a small, furnished apartment to rent by the month on the other side of town. It was sterile and impersonal, but it was quiet. It was mine. The silence was the most profound thing. For the first time in my adult life, there was no one else's mood to manage, no one else's needs to anticipate. There was just me. And I had to face the terrifying, liberating truth that I had no idea who that was. Telling the children was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I met them for lunch, and I told them the truth. Not all of it, not the ugliest parts, but enough. They were sad, of course, but they were not surprised. "Mom," my daughter Clara said, reaching across the table to take my hand, her eyes full of a wisdom that broke my heart. "We know. We've always known you weren't happy." And my son, Daniel, my quiet, observant boy, just nodded. "Dad loves his own misery more than he loves anyone else," he said, with a bluntness that was both brutal and freeing. "We just want you to be okay." In their sad, loving, accepting faces, I saw my one true success. I had not failed them. I had given them a love so strong it had made them capable of seeing the truth. A month after I left, I knew there was one last thing I had to do. I called Richard and told him I needed to come to the house to get the rest of my things. I arranged to come on a Saturday morning when I knew he would be out. Walking back into the house was strange. It already felt less like my home. I packed my books, my personal papers, my clothes. And then I went to the attic. The air was thick and hot, just as I remembered. And there it was under the eaves. The cedar chest. The coffin of the girl I used to be. For the first time in over 30 years, I knelt on the dusty floorboards and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and old paper filled the air. Inside, it was all there. A jumble of my past. My old diaries, bound in faded leather. A lock of my baby hair, tied with a blue ribbon. My high school diploma. And on top, the photograph from my college graduation. I picked it up. There we were, Arthur, Eleanor, and Shirley. A perfect family, frozen in a perfect moment, just before the world came crashing down. I looked at my father's stern, proud face, at my mother's fragile smile. I looked at the beaming, naive girl in the middle. I felt a pang of sadness for her, for all the pain she was about to endure. But I did not feel the old, all-consuming grief. I did not feel the rage. I just felt a quiet, distant pity. They were just people. Flawed, broken people who had made a terrible choice. Their choice had defined me for so long, but it didn't have to anymore. I sorted through the chest. I took my diaries. I took the baby blanket my grandmother had knitted. I took the things that belonged to Shirley, the girl, before she had become a daughter, a wife, a mother, a tragedy. I left the photograph. I left the letters from my parents from when I was at summer camp, full of love and admonitions that now seemed hollow. I was not erasing my past. I was curating it. I was choosing what to carry forward. I closed the lid of the chest and left it there in the attic. It was no longer a coffin. It was just a box of old things, memories that belonged to a house I no longer lived in, to a life I was leaving behind. My new life is a small one. I have my own apartment, filled with my books and plants in the windows. I have a part-time job at a local bookstore, surrounded by the stories I love. I have my children, who call me every Sunday. Some days are lonely. The silence can be heavy. The future is not a grand, exciting vista. It's a quiet, unmarked path that I am learning to walk, one day at a time. But it is my path. For the first time, it is mine. I don't know what will happen with Richard. I don't know if we will ever speak of anything but the logistics of separation. I don't know if he will ever understand what happened. But I know that it no longer matters. My story is no longer tied to his. Last week, I was planting petunias in a window box on my small balcony. The sun was warm on my back, and the soil was cool and dark in my hands. And for a moment, I was overcome with a feeling so pure and simple it almost brought me to tears. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was peace. The profound, quiet peace of finally being home, not in a house or with a person, but inside my own skin. I am 60 years old, and my life, my real life, has just begun.